combat sport are just a who punch you harder, think again. Today, we break down the truly define the fighter age from energy system to weight cut. Welcome to the very first episode of the Sports Brain. I'm your host, Earth, a physiotherapist with the deep passion of sports science, performance. This podcast explores the science behind athletic success from injury prevention, recovery biomechanics, psychology, and the high performance training. To started this journey strong, today we dive into the combat sports, one of the most intense, technical, and misunderstood area of performance science. And I could not think the better person to kick off with. It's my professor, Dr. Kirk, and someone who mentor me and work closely to understand the science behind how the stronger and the fighter train, recover, and manage the stress of the making weight. So, Professor, welcome to the show, and thank you for being my very first guest.
Hello, thank you for having me on. Thank you for the very generous introduction there. And yeah, I'm glad to be the first guest on your show.
I'm honored to kick off with someone who guided me a lot. So let's start. We talk about the optimizing performance in combat sports like a training, energy system, injury prevention, weight cut, and all this thing. So, sir, can you share your insight how you become involved in the combat sports specifically?
Yes, so I've been involved in combat sports, either training, competing, and work with athletes since around about 2007, 2008, when I first became a fan of. I've always been a fan of combat sports through boxing because in the UK, boxing is a very popular sport. Um, and I grew up playing basketball and football because obviously everyone plays football in the UK, but I'm also relatively tall for the non-population, so I also got dragged into basketball. And I played that for many years, but I got to a point where I just wanted to do something completely different. So I thought I'd try out a combat sport, and ended up quite randomly started to train taekwondo rather than boxing. I just thought taekwondo is something completely different. It's something that I've never done. Um, so I jumped in and thought I'd just spend the summer doing taekwondo before going back for the start of the basketball season. The start of the basketball season came around, and I just carried on just doing taekwondo. I never actually went back to that basketball. But this just happened to be at the time when MMA, mixed martial arts, was starting to really explode in popularity through organisations such as the UFC. Pride was just winding down at the time. Affliction had a couple of big shows along with Strikeforce and the WEC. So I started to become more and more interested in MMA. I started training MMA with the intention of competing in MMA, but I very quickly realised that competition wasn't in my future as far as MMA. I very much categorise the world into fighters and everyone else. And the people who are real fighters, they are very, very different types of people to the rest of us. They're the type of people who have uh, no problems with getting punched or with hitting someone in turn, but not in an aggressive manner, but just in a competition manner. Of they've got no problems with pain or getting hurt or injury. The rest of us normal people, we absolutely do have problems with that. Sorry, we absolutely do have problems with that, and it's not a natural thing for me to punch someone straight back. So obviously, in combat sports, that's quite an important thing. So rather than going down the competition route, I ended up going down the studying route. So through mixed martial arts, MMA, I also got involved in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and then training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And that was around about the same time that I decided I wanted to do a master's degree in sport and exercise science, and I wanted to do it through research. So I decided to go down the academic route and become a researcher and a sports scientist working predominantly in combat sports. And over the past 15 years, I've published several studies. I'm in the process of writing a couple of book chapters, and I've worked with several professional combat sport athletes in MMA, boxing, and in jiu-jitsu. And that's me today.
Thank you so much. So, what makes your sport unique? Like a combat sport, it's unique sport, right? So what's make the unique, like in the perspective of physiology and performance science? What makes this unique? Like,
That's a great question. So combat sports are very much unique in the demands that are placed on the athletes and the people taking part. So with most team sports, they will have moments of high intense work, of repeated sprints, for instance, or lots of changes of direction. But the majority of that work will be at a low to moderate intensity in most team sports. So in football, for example, you might have players who do several sprints, but then they might not sprint again for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and the rest of the time is spent jogging or potentially walking. Um, in track and field sports, you either have the events where it's instantaneous, high impulse, one off, such as a javelin throw or a high jump, or it might be 10 to 40 seconds of maximum intensity work, such in the sprints. Then at the far end of that, you've got your marathon runners who are doing low to moderate intensity for 2 hours. Um, Now, combat sports is a sport of continuous repeated sprints or extended over potentially 30 minutes if it's in boxing, 15 minutes if it's in MMA, 9 minutes if it's taekwondo, 6 minutes if it's judo. So the physiological requirements are that you need to be able to work at a very high intensity or repeated sprints, or want of a better word, repeated high impulse actions, being able to maintain it for what is essentially a middle distance length of time. Now, in MMA in particular, the maximum length of a bout for most professional bouts is 15 minutes. If you're going to equate that to a track and field event, you're looking at doing a 5K event or one of the better, sorry, yeah, 5K event for better purposes. But that's a high intensity with repeated high intensity impulse actions. Now, add on to that, these high impulse repeated actions are punching and kicking, isometric grappling actions. It's receiving physical impact to the head, to the body, to the legs, to the arms, whilst also being having to hold your opponent's body mass on top of you in a grappling position and pushing up against the wall in grappling positions as well. So, in addition to it being very, very complex physiologically, it's also very high impact because the point of these sports is to cause pain and trauma to your opponent. So there's not many other sports where that level of physiological requirement alongside the requirement for sustaining trauma exists. You can look at sports like American football and rugby where trauma does occur, but it's fairly irregular trauma in comparison to combat sports. In combat sports, you might receive blunt force trauma to the head and body every 2 or 3 seconds. In American football, it's 3 or 4 times in an hour. In rugby, it's 3 or 4 times every 10, 15 minutes. So it's very, very complex and quite a unique puzzle that we're still trying to get to the bottom of.
okay, so you talk about the performance and the physiology about the impulse, how that impulse work and how that work. So directly we straight into that. There is a one debate about the aerobic and anaerobic capacity in the combat sport. There are lots of people just confused about the aerobic and aerobic, because when any athlete started the combat sport from the grassroots, they always think about which training I do, aerobic training or anaerobic capacity training. So could you explain how two energy system are work differently in compared to traditional like a football or the rugby in the combat sports?
And you're right. This is it's quite a common misconception across quite a lot of sports, but in particular combat sports, because we have this idea that it's the knockout punch that wins the fight, or it's the big takedown that wins the position. Um, well, that's one tiny aspect of an entire performance. So, for instance, in football, we don't look at one sprint from a player on the wing that led to a goal. We don't classify that as the entire 90-minute performance. That was just one sprint that happened to be important at that point. So in all sports in general, we get caught up in this talk about whether it's aerobic or whether it's anaerobic. And even in training and exercise, we get caught up in the idea of, well, this is aerobic training and this is anaerobic training. That misses the fundamental point that we are never, ever either just anaerobic or just aerobic. Even if we do something at maximum intensity for 2 or 3 seconds, where we are at that point, we're only resynthesizing ATP through the anaerobic pathways. Those anaerobic pathways then have to be replenished through aerobic means. So even if we just do very high intensity flat out work for a couple of seconds, at that point it's anaerobic. But as soon as we stop and as soon as we start to go past those 2 or 3 seconds, it immediately becomes aerobic, because that's just the nature of how our energy systems work and how ATP resynthesis works. So this seems to be where the confusion comes from. So if we're involved in a sport of repeated high impulse actions, the first 2 or 3 of those high impulse actions will be resynthesizing ATP purely from the creatine phosphate system, for example. But then we need to look at it being a dimmer switch. Rather than a switch on and off, it's a dimmer switch. So the first 2 or 3 seconds of high intensity work, yes, it might only be creatine phosphate. After those 2 or 3 seconds, the body will already realize that creatine phosphate is being depleted, and it has to start using other forms of energy in order to meet the demands. So after 2 or 3 seconds of you punching and kicking or involved in a grappling situation, the body will already be moving towards glycogen. It will start to increase it slightly, and then as soon as you stop after, let's say, 6 seconds of punching and kicking or grappling, the body will straight away start using aerobic means in order to replenish that creatine phosphate and start to increase the amount of glycogen that can be used. So it doesn't take that long for the body to start moving its dimmer switch from entirely anaerobic more towards aerobic further and further. Now, if you have a 2 or 3 second rest in between those punch and kicks, between those grappling actions, or there's just 2 or 3 seconds of you circling away from the opponent, it's then going to allow you to start using more aerobic energy. But then if you get straight back into the punching and kicking phase, creatine phosphate hasn't had a chance to fully replenish. Your glycogen stores are already being used. Now the body will push the dimmer switch even further towards the aerobic side. And then if you carry that on for 15 minutes, it's almost entirely become aerobic means, with every now and then a high intensity action that will be a bit more reliant on creatine phosphate, but it's still more reliant on glycogen overall. Also, glycogen and fat, I should say. And this has been evidenced quite well in quite a lot of combat sports. Work done by the likes of Professor Emerson Francini and Professor Victor Coswig. They've done quite a few studies now showing that the aerobic contribution to combat sports performance is at least 65%, probably closer up to the 80% mark, mainly because the length of time we're doing this work for and how repeated these actions are, it very much comes towards the aerobic means. Now, that's not to say that the anaerobic capacity isn't important, but it's mainly to allow you to minimize the aerobic requirements whilst you're doing the actions. Then in between the actions and repeating the actions, it becomes more and more aerobic. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so it means we focus on the aerobic more than the anaerobic capacity training, like a when we go with the sport specific conditioning, like aerobic training and anaerobic training. So what's the sum based training strategy you use during your practice, like improving the anaerobic and aerobic capacity? So can you just define
Yeah,
that?
yeah, absolutely. So I would agree that the main focus of training for most athletes should be the aerobic side. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, the aerobic side underpins everything we do. If we don't have sufficient aerobic capacity, then we don't have a large enough engine to run the machine that the human body is. The second part of that is that in terms of combat sports, aerobic training is relatively low intensity. You can do a lot of it without adding further strain, further trauma onto the athlete's bodies. Now, the anaerobic work I look at as being peaking ready for competition, because we do need to have a well-developed anaerobic capacity. We need our athletes to have a high muscle buffering capacity because they are going to be increasing muscle and blood acidity quite a lot very quickly. So the release of hydrogen ions comes into the muscle very, very quickly as soon as you start doing high intensity actions. The amount of carbon dioxide being produced by the muscles ramps up very quickly as well. So they have to be capable of buffering against that increased acidity. So the anaerobic capacity is important. So my general approach is throughout, so in between training camps, almost all the conditioning work that the athlete should be doing should be low to moderate intensity aerobic capacity building. This is the boring work, unfortunately. This is the long runs or cycles or times on the rowing machine. It's anything from 70 to 80% of maximum heart rate, very low on the RPE scale, 40, 45 to 60 minutes, just plodding along, building that aerobic base. Now, what that is doing is that's increasing and maximizing the amount of time that the heart is placed under strain to allow maximal stroke volume to be increased. Now, this is also going to lead to more angiogenesis, leading to more capillaries built around the working muscles to allow that oxygen delivery. Now, that in turn will increase VO2 max. Now, this is not to say that high intensity interval training doesn't have a place. It absolutely does. But what we find and what the current research is pretty clear on is that high intensity interval training will bring about increases in stroke volume and angiogenesis very rapidly for the first couple of months. And after that, it tends to plateau off. If we base most of our training around low to moderate intensity, steady state training, then we get those increases for a much longer period of time and to a much greater extent over time as well. So, outside of training camp, I would focus on steady state, low to moderate intensity endurance work, the boring stuff, the stuff where you need to have a few podcasts lined up. If you're doing it on a rowing machine or a cyclogometer, get Netflix up on the iPad, make sure you've got a film to watch, just make sure you don't get bored of this kind of work. And this is the bit that we struggle with the combat sport athletes. Because combat sport people by nature don't like doing low intensity stuff. They like the excitement of high intensity interactive work. Just sitting on a rowing machine for an hour, they get bored very quickly. So it is a struggle to get people to do it. Now heading into training camp, so heading into the 8 to 12 weeks preparation for a competition, this is where I would start to bring in the high intensity interval training work. I would focus on long intervals. So intervals that are 3 to 5 minutes long, working at least 95% of their velocity of VO2 max, with 2 minutes complete passive rest in between each interval, with 5 to 7 intervals dependent on the athlete's current fitness levels. Now, what that's doing is it's still allowing the aerobic capacity to be increased. Because it's bringing in that high intensity work, it's starting to shift it a little bit more towards the muscle buffering and a little bit more towards that neuromuscular adaptations that we want as well. So the nervous system is now starting to fire at high intensity. So it started to take it away from the steady state work, bringing it more towards the intermittent work that the athlete needs. Now, as we get into the final 3-4 weeks before competition, this is when we really need to start ramping up the intensity. And this is where the peaking and the full use of the anaerobic capacity starts to come in. So this is where repeat sprint intervals will be used. Again, whether it's on the feet, on the rowing machine, on the treadmill, on the cyclogometer, whichever tool you want to use. This would involve 6 to 8 bouts of 3 to 5 seconds, hard as possible, interspersed by about 4 or 5 seconds rest in a block of about 6 to 8 sprints. 4 minutes rest, do it again. 4 minutes rest, do it again. 4 minutes rest, do it again. But absolutely flat out, as hard as you can possibly go. Now, this is focusing very much on the peripheral system. So very much on the muscle buffering capacity, very much on the recovery of creatine phosphate in between each sprint, and very much focusing on that neuromuscular, getting the nervous system firing to make the muscles contract as hard as they can. Now, the reason why we do it just before competition is that's the intensity that we're going to be working at in competition. That's the muscle buffering they need in competition. But that type of training will only give you adaptations for about 4 weeks because the anaerobic capacity is limited. There is very much a low ceiling on adaptations you can get on your anaerobic capacity and on those peripheral adaptations. So if you base your entire training around the repeat sprint, anaerobic work, then if you do 12 weeks of that, 8 weeks you spend training, no real adaptations coming in. And it doesn't have a great effect on the central system, the stroke volume, or the oxygen delivery. So we do need to do all three types of training. The steady state work outside of training camp builds that engine, builds the stroke volume, brings about angiogenesis, also helps with fat metabolism adaptations as well. The long hit in the first half of training camp, that allows you to start increasing the intensity while still bringing about those central adaptations before moving into 3, 4 weeks of anaerobic, flat out, high intensity sprints to get that peak in ready. And that in that system, you've covered everything that the athlete needs in terms of energy systems and their oxygen delivery.
Yeah, so you would talk about the aerobic and anaerobic capacity according to how the training work, how your the camp work. But when I read all the combat sport, there are two type of combat sport, like a grappling and the striking combat sports. So do you think that these two type are different, aerobic and anaerobic capacity, and also man physical demand across the different type of combat sports? Do you think that thing?
Um, well, they've certainly got different physical demands, but I think they're mainly going to be neuromuscular in nature rather than energy system or uh, cardiorespiratory. Uh, the main reason I think that they're going to be quite similar in terms of cardiorespiratory is the length of time that they're working for and the fact that they're still all repeated high intensity, high impulse actions. Um, in terms of the length of time that they last for, I might be incorrect, but I think wrestling matches, wrestling rounds last about 3 minutes, being the shortest, with MMA rounds being 5 minutes being the longest. If you do anything for 3 to 5 minutes, you're going to be working more aerobically than anaerobically. So I think just by the nature of the length of time that they're expected to compete for, I think the cardiorespiratory demands are going to be quite similar. Now, in terms of neuromuscular demands, the striking based sports are by nature on the feet, almost predominantly. And if anyone is knocked off their feet, the round comes to an end or the bout comes to an end. So, in terms of what you're required to do, most of it is going to be high impulse actions from the lower limbs to push off the ground to deliver the strikes or to deliver the kicks, whilst performing the same kind of actions into the ground to try and dodge or move away from the punches and kicks, with not a great deal of isometric work. There will be some isometric work. So some of the striking sports do allow clinches. So Muay Thai is heavily based around the clinch as well. There's some clinching in boxing, not a great deal. In sports like Taekwondo or Western style kickboxing, there's hardly any clinching whatsoever. As soon as they start clinching, the referee breaks them up. So there's not a lot of isometric work there. The grappling sports, however, there is a great deal of isometric work. So if we're talking about judo or wrestling, when the athletes first physically engage with each other and start trying to push and pull each other off balance or start trying to get a dominant position, it's very much around isometric holds. So grabbing the opponent's gi to try and pull it towards you, at that point, you've got a lot of isometric work there. Similarly, in grounder positions, so whether we're talking about judo, wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, once you're on the ground, you have to hold your body in a very certain position to try and keep in a safe position, whether it's keeping the arms tucked in or keeping your body in a semicircle to protect the uh, to protect your center of gravity, or even if you're in a top position trying to base all your weight down through the opponent, you have to hold a very specific position. So these isometric actions become more and more important. So these isometric actions can make a big difference. And I believe that this is what we tend to see causing most of the fatigue in grappling sports. And when someone first starts taking part in grappling sport, they do tend to get very tired very, very quickly because your initial reaction to having someone on top of you is to tense up and start trying to push them away like that, which becomes very, very tiring. Um, and you'll notice that the experienced grapplers, they don't have any expression on their face. They've learned to relax into it, push and hold when they need to, but keep everything else relaxed because that is an energy conservation action. The people who can do a lot, last a long time in a round in grappling sports, they've learned to conserve their energy by pushing and pulling certain body parts, but relaxing everything else. So I think those are the key differences between the two sports: the use of isometric actions as opposed to high impulse actions into the ground. Um, in terms of cardiorespiratory, I think they're going to be very, very similar in terms of what they're required to do. But the isometric actions versus the high impulse reactions into the ground, that's the key difference between the two categories, I think. But when you combine those two, you get mixed martial arts, you get MMA. So you have to be good on both sides, which adds another wrinkle of difficulty to training them athletes.
Yeah. So when we talk about the MMA, there is a mix MMA, mixed martial art. So do you think there are lots of athletes who started just yet or just started in future? So what is the key mistake the coach and the athlete to approaching the conditioning? Like the people are go with the strength and conditioning, and people are go with the skilled bits. Because when I'm from India, so in India we always go through the skill based sessions. So how can we balance that both things, the SNC things and the skill base, without the leading of overtraining things?
Well, that's the golden question for all sports, isn't it? How do we manage the two? How do we
Yeah.
balance the two? Yeah. Well, if someone's just starting out in combat sports, so if someone's not done combat sports before, I think the main aim for that person should be spending most of your time on skill-based sessions. Because if you've not done these sports before, combat sports in general do not come naturally to us as humans. Okay, naturally we run, we jump, we do things like that. That's why track and field, football, rugby, cricket, that's why they're the most popular sports, because they are natural to what our
That's
bodies
right.
can do. As soon as you ask someone to throw throw a roundhouse kick correctly, it's difficult to do. Our bodies don't naturally do it. It takes quite a lot of practice, quite a lot of training to do it. As soon as you try and punch someone correctly or throw a punch correctly, it's not natural. If you ever see two school kids getting in a fight, it's big swinging arms like this because it's not natural
It's
to us.
not natural.
Yeah. And then as soon as you bring in the grappling in judo, wrestling, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, it is the least natural thing you can think of. It's all the correct movements are completely counterintuitive, which is why it takes so long to learn these techniques. So if you're just starting out in combat sports, spend most of your time on skill-based sessions. Because if you've not done these things before, you will get stronger and fitter just by doing the skill-based sessions. But that increase in strength and fitness will tend to level off after about 2 to 3 to 6 months, maybe, depending on where you started off. So, in order to balance both, whether you're just starting out for fitness and fun or whether you're a competitor, you're probably still going to have to spend most of your training sessions on skill based work. Because if you're competing, your skills is what's actually going to matter when you are well matched against an opponent. In terms of strength based work for combat sport athletes don't need a huge amount of strength. They don't need to have maximal strength that matches rugby players or American football players. They don't necessarily need maximal strength that's even going to match um, a hockey player or athletes of those kinds. But they still do need to be strong relatively. Now, that amount of strength you can develop and build off 2 to 3 sessions per week, depending on your starting point. If you've never done any strength training before, 2 sessions a week will get you much, much stronger in a very short period of time. If you have done some strength training before, or you've been involved in your sport for quite a while, then 3 training sessions a week of lifting weights will still provide you the strength you need in order to compete. And these 3 strength training sessions, they don't need to be very long sessions. We're not talking 2 or 3 hours in the gym. It could be as much as little as 45 minutes if it's programmed appropriately and programmed correctly. So basing strength training sessions around things like squats, deadlifts, cleans, snatch pulls, work like that, that will get you most of the strength you need for the type of competition that you're going to be doing. And similar with cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular training. Again, general guidelines, minimum 2 sessions a week of cardiovascular work is enough for the vast majority of people or anyone with a VO2 max under about 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now, in combat sports, there are not many athletes or many sports where the average VO2 max is above 55. Boxers, you tend to see their VO2 max around 57 to 63. And the reason for that is because boxers traditionally do a lot of steady state cardiovascular work. It's very much bred into the boxing culture that you do a lot of aerobic work because they, over the last 150 years of boxing's history, they've kind of figured out that being fit is good for the sport.
Yeah.
Uh, so boxers, they tend to have well-developed VO2 maxes for combat sport athletes. MMA fighters, they could have, there's some studies which show MMA fighters having VO2 max down in the low 40s. Absolute, very bog standard normal person VO2 max. So with MMA fighters, 2 cardiovascular sessions a week will be enough to increase their VO2 max where we need it. So 2 to 3 cardiovascular sessions per week, 2 to 3 strength training sessions a week, and then you can balance your training load in your skill-based sessions to have 2 high-intensity days per week and every other day low intensity, while still improving your skill. And this is very much a basic pattern. This is the kind of pattern that we see in the vast majority of sports. We're just applying it to combat sports as well.
Okay, so you talk about how we differentiate and how to put the training session per week. So you you see that strength and conditioning level and then skill based level. But when we talk about the technical and tactical look like, when you look like an elite athlete, you also see lots of elite athletes like in combat sport MMA. So do you believe that the technical and tactical training is priority over the physical training during the camp phase, or and during the SNC with the SNC coach, with the coaches like a maximum elite athletic development? How you do you believe that there is a difference between physical training and then camp phase?
Um, in terms of which one takes priority, I think the
Yeah.
timing in relation to competition is what really matters. So if it's 1 month before a competition, then the technical tactical training has to be the absolute priority. So they have to have their skills and their techniques and their tactics for the bouts. They have to be the absolute priority there. But if you're 4 months away from competition, then having your technique and your tactics and your skills, and you're still at a point where we're just building up in terms of fitness and in terms of getting ready for that competition. So if it's 4 months away from competition, then the priority and the intensity and the load should be around strength work and around cardiovascular work, because that's the point where you have the time to work on those things. That's the period of time where the technical tactical training isn't going to be that high intensity. It's going to be pretty low intensity. And they might have only just come out of a fight about a couple of months previously. So they're not going to be taking much impact in their technical tactical training sessions. So 3, 4 months out from a competition, the training load and intensity in tactical training sessions should be low, with the strength work and the aerobic sessions having the high training load. And then the closer to get towards competition, the closer these two come together before eventually the intensity in the tactical training sessions increases and the S&C starts to decrease. Now, it shouldn't decrease to the point where you're not able to maintain it. As you approach competition, the strength and conditioning session should be very, very short duration. So 20, 30, 15 minutes, absolute most, but very high intensity. with the majority of the time being on that technical, tactical work. And it's the same model that we see in team sports like rugby and football. In the off season, the S&C, very high training load. The aerobic work, very high training load. In the season, however, when it's the games and the technical training that matters, it's very low training load on the S&C, but relatively high intensity, just to keep that maintenance, just to keep things ticking along. Whereas all the work then is on the technical, tactical work. So it depends on where they are in timing to the competition, determines which one takes priority. But if I was going to put a percentage on it in terms of the number of training sessions per week, I would say that 70% of the training sessions per week should be technical, tactical based work. And that's regardless of whether they're out of camp or in camp. What changes is the intensity and actual training load of these sessions over time. That's where the swap around comes.
Okay, so it's about how we process that SNC, and then the camp start within the 2 to 3 months. We have to just cut down the SNC, and then probably we go with the skill based program. So yeah, so when we talk about the skill base and the SNC, but what about the people are just thinking this is new era of combat sport, the MMA, and people think about weight cutting and weight cutting management, because there are lots of new rules coming up in the combat sport key. This is the criteria for weight, and if you have 500 gram more, they are not allowed to do the competition. So what's your perspective in the culture of extreme weight cutting in the combat sport, like within the strength and conditioning and then skill based?
Uh, so the weight cutting is very much an issue in combat sports. And again, it's something that's very much embedded in the culture and always has been since the bare knuckle days of the 1800s. People have been cutting weight in order to meet their weight classes. The effect it has on performance and the effect it has on health is very much a controversial topic. It's clear that it's only a negative for health, particularly to the extent that MMA fighters do it. So most combat sport athletes will reduce their body weight by about 3 to 5%. MMA fighters do it by about 8%, with some going as high as 14, 15% in the week before competition. Now, it's pretty clear that this is very damaging for the endocrine system. There's quite a few reports, both in academic peer-reviewed articles and in news reports, around fighters having kidney issues and liver issues based on their weight cutting processes. Now, in terms of whether or not it provides an advantage in competition, there's very much a debate around this. It seems in professional boxing that the more weight you cut and regain gives you a higher chance of winning. In MMA, I've worked on a couple of papers now with Vincent Barabeau and colleagues such as Carl Lang and Evans, where it's a mixed picture in MMA. At the regional level in MMA, it does seem that the person who cuts the most weight and regains most weight has a higher chance of winning. However, at the elite level, meaning UFC, Bellator, PFL, there doesn't seem to be any difference. Okay, there is no difference in the amount regained or before competition, rather the winners or the losers. So how we tie this into the training and preparation for the athlete? Well, first of all, they have to make weight. If they don't make weight, they can't compete. In an ideal world, everyone would just move up a weight class. I don't see any reason for everyone to be cutting 8% of their body mass, where everyone could cut 4% of their body mass, move up a weight category, and everyone's still facing the same people. Because that's what we tend to see. Everyone in each weight class is pretty much the same size as each other, both height, limb length, overall body mass, they're the same size. So they're all on a race to the bottom. They're all draining their bodies, putting themselves at risk just to fight the same people. Now, that's the ideal world. Everyone just moves up one weight class each. But I know that we don't live in an ideal world, particularly now with everything that's going on. So because of the culture of the sport is still based around everyone cutting as much weight as they can, it's then the job of the coaches to make that weight cut as less severe as possible. Now, there are many fighters who will leave their weight cut up until that final week before competition. They will just stop all training and then just starve themselves and dehydrate themselves just to cut all that weight, all the weight in the final week. But if we think about the types of training that we've just been talking about, if you spend 3 months doing aerobic training, then your body becomes fat adapted. By definition, it's increasing the number of mitochondria and it's increasing the enzyme activity of those mitochondria. That means the body's more effective at using fat as energy. It's also more effective at using glycogen as energy. That means the body will have less mass and fat overall. Now, if you spend your weight training sessions around high intensity squats, high intensity deadlifts, high intensity cleans, and high intensity snatch pulls, you are going to get stronger, but you won't put on that much muscle mass. You'll put on some, but not a great deal. Now, those two things combined together will make the athlete leaner overall, and it will make them more impulsive overall as well. So just by doing those two types of training over the 3 months, you are already going to be bringing the athlete's body mass down a little bit and making it more receptive to reducing its own body mass when you start to remove or reduce energy intake and reduce fluid intake. So by having an athlete who is in shape as an athlete makes the weight cut easier anyway. Then over the final 2 weeks of competition, I would say that the weight cut should happen over 2 weeks, not over 1 week. If it's a gradual reduction in energy intake, but keeping the athlete above their resting metabolic rate or on their resting metabolic rate, then the weight will come off. They will lose body fat, they will lose body water, they will lose mass. Then the final 2 or 3 days, take them below their resting metabolic rates in terms of energy intake, and they will start to make weight. There are a couple of other things that need to be done on there as well, but for the details of the weight cut, I would strongly recommend all the listeners to go and read a work by Dr. Carl Langan-Evans. He published it back in 2010. The paper's called Weight Making in Combat Sports. That's still the main text for cutting weight in combat sports. All the key details are in there of how to get an athlete safely on weight whilst minimizing the effect on their performance and minimizing the effect on their health. But essentially, it still comes to that same basic fact. If you spend the time in between the camp physiologically preparing the athlete's body to be lean and to reduce its mass, the whole process will be much easier in the long run.
Yeah, so you talk about the health and overall health about the athlete when we started the weight cutting and the skill and essence base. So there are lots of research around the health. People just starting the weight cutting, and after the competition there are lots of injuries doing into combat sports. So what is the common thing you see after weight cutting or strength and conditioning? Key people are suffering from this type of injuries, and this is the common in combat sports, like after the weight cutting.
Um, in terms of injuries, the main injuries from combat sports are impact-based trauma. So from getting punched and kicked and from getting grappled and twisted quite a lot. To be honest, I don't see many injuries from a strength and conditioning standpoint because the amount of strength and conditioning that fighters do in terms of overall volume is relatively low because it doesn't need to be that high for what they need. Most of the injuries come from getting punched and kicked a lot and getting grappled a lot, and the amount of technical tactical training that they have to do. So if you next Monday went to a combat sports session, you got punched and kicked, you'd be sore for a couple of days after. But for a fighter, they will get punched and kicked on a Monday morning, and then they'll have to get punched and kicked again on a Monday afternoon, and then again on a Tuesday morning, then again on a Tuesday afternoon. And it's that continuous volume of impact without getting any real chance to recover and let that impact dissipate before they have to do it all again. That's where the injuries come from. But that's the reason why most fighters they can't do more than 2 or 3 competitions per year, just because that continuous impact on the body is not sustainable. And you read about boxers in the 1920s having 14 fights a year and 200 fights in a career.
It's different.
Their bodies were a mess after a few years of training.
It's different.
There's a reason we don't do it that way anymore.
So that's the traditional combat sport training, and right now it's the new era of combat sport like started, and people just focusing on the strength and conditioning, skill based training, tactical, technical, and overall area of that. So what do you feel the most underrated element in combat sport preparation today rather than the traditional one? What's the element?
The most underrated,
Yeah, underrated element.
yeah, aerobic conditioning. Aerobic conditioning, absolutely. In fact, let me change the answer a little bit. In mixed martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's aerobic conditioning. That is the least used tool by these athletes. In boxing and kickboxing, strength training is the most underused tool. So you will find this the combat sport athletes split into two camps. They have the very fit but very weak people who tend to be in the striking only sports, and the fairly strong but very, very low fitness people in the grappling sports. So grapplers, MMA fighters, you need to do aerobic work. Strikers, you need to do strength work. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, and there are lots of myth around the combat sport, like people just do the aerobic, so that they do just aerobic training. People just do the anaerobic training, then go with the aerobic. So, what the one concept or the myth you wish to more athlete understood better? Like, how could you change that athlete preparation? What would you do the first?
Um, structure the training as though it's a season. So at the start of the season, do low intensity work, but lots of it. As you get towards the end of the season where the fight happens, do high intensity work and lots of it. And if we get those blend between the two things, you'll hit all the markers. So everyone needs aerobic capacity, everyone needs anaerobic capacity, everyone needs strength, everyone needs impulse. But it's how and when we train these four things leading up to the competition that matters. It's not one or the other. We need all of them, but we need to plan it out in advance and treat the 4 months leading up to competition as an individual season. That's the way I would approach it.
Yeah, so just only not focus on the one training for protocol, just focus on the four based protocol like aerobic, anaerobic, and skill based also. So, what's your message for the combat sport athlete who just start or who just started 2 years, and what's your last message for this podcast about that?
My main message to the people who've just started combat sports in the last couple of years is carry on enjoying it. They're great sports. They're so much fun. You get so much from it. But if you're wanting to do this competitively and do it for a long period of time, make sure you build the engine. Make sure you actually take care of your body. Make sure you do both types of conditioning, both types of strength work, and make sure you do it in a way that's balanced against your skill and technique. And your body will hold up throughout your entire time in combat sports and afterwards. And it'll make it a lot more fun because then you're injured a lot less often and you get to spend more time on the mats.
And this is the just the insight about the how the coaches and how the people are work in the elite level, how the combat sport work in the elite level. This they're just curious about. There are lots of people. I just started, so I just put this podcast on the and there are just few people from the combat sport or combat sport athlete to see this podcast. But I want to just started the new era of the combat sport, new era of the athletic recovery and all the thing. So thank you so much to being part of this first episode of the Sports Pen, and it's my pleasure to just you are a part of my first podcast. So this the foundation of everything podcast is about the science, recovery, and training. So if you found the value today episode, whether you are coach, student, and just curious about you being behind the performance, make sure you subscribe and follow the YouTube and Instagram, the Sports Brain. We are just getting started. Upcoming episode will be dive into Indian recovery, biomechanics, sports psychology, and more with the professional who will love with the world every day. Until next time, stay curious, stay smart, and keep unlocking the brain behind sport. I'm your host, Earth, the sports brain. Thank you so much.